Morrison.
Thank you very much, Mr Chair. I want to talk today in the context of Part 3 and in particular Clause 65.3 about Tom Sewell, who was a 21-year-old British backpacker who came to New Zealand. Actually, he came on a working holiday visa, and he found his way to the Bay of Plenty region where he got a job working on a kiwi fruit orchard. On his very first day, he died in a quad bike accident. He didn't have a helmet, he had no training, he had nobody support him on that first day. His family in Britain remain today bemused by the fact that this could happen in a country like New Zealand. And for anyone who thinks that this is just about the sheer tragedy of somebody like Tom Sewell and his family, it's also about our international reputation. Websites have been devoted to what has happened to people like Tom Sewell, who've come to New Zealand, their families expecting that they would be looked after, their families expecting that someone who came to work to ride a machine like a quad bike would be given at least some training. And it didn't happen. And under Clause 65.3 of this bill, if Tom Sewell's equivalent comes to New Zealand, there won't need to be the workplace health and safety representative appointed. They're excluded. They're not here. They're not deemed to be high risk. And that is wrong, Mr Chair. That is wrong. It's wrong in the memory of people like Tom Sewell, and it's wrong in the memory of the 37 other people who have died in quad bike accidents over the last few years. Just because that orchard falls outside the Minister's definition of what is a high-risk workplace is not good enough. We owe it to everyone who goes to work in this country, whether there's someone here on a working holiday visa on their first day at work, or someone who's been a miner on the West Coast for 40 years going to work again day after day. We owe it to every single one of those people that when they go to work, we have done everything that we can to ensure their safety. And if we pass this part in its form now, we can't answer that question. We can't say we've done everything we could have if we pass Clause 65.3. And I do want to acknowledge Marama Fox. I know the Māori Party support the SOP in Ian Lees Galloway's name to delete that clause, and I thank them for that support. But for us, what this means is that if this goes through as it is now, we cannot support this bill. And I reject the notion that it's somehow or other a dichotomy between what's here right now and the old legislation. Because it's not. Because the pathway this legislation was going down was one where this whole Parliament would have supported it. Where we had large employers, small employers, worker organisations, the families of those who had loved ones died, all supporting the pathway we were going down. And then the government comes along. And now we've got a situation where this part of the law is no longer about risk to workers, it's about political risk. And that, Mr Speaker, is wrong. It's about, Mr Chair, the political risk to the National Party of their supporters, because there can be no other way of explaining the extraordinary definitions of high risk that now fall under Clause 65 of this bill. There's no way of explaining why you would exclude sheep, poultry and cattle farming, but include alpaca farming, bird breeding, cat breeding, crocodile farming, worm farming. It's ridiculous, Mr Speaker. If it wasn't so tragic, it would be hilarious. This is a farce, Mr Speaker. Do you realise a high-risk industry, according to this minister, is curtain installation, but demolishing a building isn't? I'm not very good at putting up curtains, Mr Chair, and actually it's probably quite high risk when I do it. But it shouldn't be in a list of high-risk industries, Mr Chair. This minister needs to get on his feet and tell us how it is that cattle and dairy farming orchards, kiwi fruit, that kind of thing, are not deemed high risk. And if it's about saying we average it out over a year to find the figure, then that's not right. We all know that farming is a seasonal business, Mr. Chair. We need to look at the rates of death, Mr. Chair. We need to look at the rates of death in the industries in their peak periods. There's no point in looking at it across the whole year. That's a meaningless statistic. And we know that in farming, particularly in cattle and dairy farming, and in those intensive cropping industries where there's difficult terrain, that's where we see the deaths, Mr. Chair. So I urge members of the House to support Ian Lees-Galloway's supplementary order paper that actually deals with this issue, remove section 65(3) so we don't have this farcical and arbitrary situation of declaring the magical figure of 20, or if it's 25 or it's 30. In the end, that denies the reality of the existence that people like Tom Sewell went through. And I believe strongly, Mr. Chair, that as a country, New Zealand cannot afford our reputation to continue to be tarnished by what is seen internationally as a lax attitude. This bill does some good things. There's absolutely no doubt about that. We've talked about them in parts 1 and parts 2. But here in part 3, we come to the nub of it. If we are going to get health and safety to be the level we want it to be, then the role of health and safety representatives matters. Yes, let's all work together to make it practical. I agree with that. We don't want to impose impractical conditions. But if they're not conditions that involve the workers, if they're not conditions that give them the chance to be represented, to, as Marama Fox said, actually know their rights, actually know what they're able to do, then they don't live up to the standards that we require. And Mr. Chair, in this call and perhaps another one, I want to talk also about the amendments that we are proposing to clause 66 of the bill. Because in clause 66 of the bill, 66(4)(a), we want to add in the phrase, the new clause AB, agree the work group structure with workers. This is a critical point, Mr. Chair, because it's great that there will be a work group. It's great that we're building the partnerships within the workplace to ensure health and safety. But if we don't have worker representation in the establishment of those groups, we miss out on so much. Mr. Chair, every business I go into today talks to me about the importance of involving their workers in the way they manage their firms. We all heard the stories about the lean manufacturing model, about high-performance workplaces. Every single one of those now is built on the principle of engagement, that it's hopeless to impose on a workforce a whole set of rules that they've had no involvement in whatsoever. It's not productive. It doesn't help with the bottom line, and it also doesn't help with the health and safety of workers. So that's why clause 66 starts again, as so much of this legislation does, off on the right path of the idea that there will be a work group that will help determine the health and safety conditions. But if we don't have in that the structure of that work group is agreed with workers, then we fall down at the hurdle again. Who knows the most about what's going to work in terms of health and safety? The workers who go in every single day. And the tragedy of Pike River is that those workers were not listened to when they raised concerns day after day after day. When we're setting up a new structure, a better structure, Mr. Chair, and I acknowledge the Minister, this is a better structure. But if we set it up without including the worker voice, without listening to the people who know the most about health and safety, then we fail. We fail to deliver on the very promise that we should have been making from day one to those who have lost loved ones in workplace accidents. Mr. Chair, I call on the Minister to do two things: to stand up in this House and tell us why Tom Sewell and his equivalents should not be covered by this law. This is somebody who went to work on a working holiday on a kiwi fruit orchard to ride a quad bike on his first day, and no one gave him any support or training. He wasn't given a helmet, Mr. Chair. How can that be allowed to happen? And yet, under clause 65(3) of this bill, that workplace would not be deemed to be high risk and therefore would not be deemed to have workplace health and safety representatives in the workplace. Mr. Chair, we owe it to families of those who have died to change clause 65 of this bill, to take out that arbitrary distinction and give every New Zealander worker their rights to a safe workplace.
Chairman?
Alice Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We've had a